I used to believe that love was unbreakable when built properly. That's what I told Vanessa on our wedding day 10 years ago. I'm an architect, I said during my vows, making our guests laugh through their tears. I know how to build things that last. She looked so beautiful that day, her dark hair falling in soft curls around her shoulders, her eyes shining with promises I thought we'd always keep. If I close my eyes now, I can still feel her hands in mine as we made those sacred promises. But what I've learned since then is that even the strongest foundations can crack when neglected. I'm Daniel Reynolds, and this is the story of how my perfect life collapsed around me. Our Portland neighborhood was everything we'd dreamed of when I designed our Craftsman home 5 years ago. 3 bedrooms for the family we planned to have, an open concept living area where Vanessa could practice her yoga while I sketched new designs at the dining table, and large windows that welcomed the moody Pacific Northwest light. The neighbors were mostly young professionals like us, close enough to form a community, but respectful of privacy. We hosted summer barbecues in our backyard, where strings of lights hung between cedar trees I'd planted when we first moved in. Those evenings, with laughter echoing across our patio and Vanessa's hand resting casually on my knee, felt like the embodiment of everything I'd worked for. My architectural firm was growing, and I'd recently landed a major contract designing a sustainable community center downtown. The hours were long, but Vanessa seemed to understand. "This is your moment," she'd say, kissing me goodbye as I left for another early morning. "I'm proud of you." I tried to make up for my absence with small gestures, leaving notes in her coffee mug, bringing home her favorite pastries from that little bakery she loved, planning weekend getaways to the coast whenever my schedule allowed. I thought it was enough. Maybe that was my first mistake. Jason Cooper moved into the house next door about 6 months ago, after his divorce was finalized. I remember helping him unload the moving truck, both of us sweating in the unusual Portland heat wave. "Man, I appreciate this," he said, offering me a beer when we finished. He was easy to talk to, a marketing executive who worked mostly from home, with a dry sense of humor and stories about traveling the world for business. "Vanessa and I should have you over for dinner sometime," I suggested that day, not seeing the invisible thread of fate that had begun to unspool between our lives. We did have him over many times. He became a regular at our neighborhood gatherings, always bringing expensive wine and making everyone laugh with his stories. I liked him. That's what makes this all so much worse. I liked the man who would eventually destroy my life. The first changes were so subtle, I barely noticed them. Vanessa started wearing different perfume, something deeper, more sensual than her usual light floral scent. She spent more time getting ready in the mornings, even on days when she was just working from home as a freelance graphic designer. Her phone became a permanent attachment, and she'd take calls on the back deck, her voice too low for me to hear. When I'd ask who called, she'd wave it off. "Just a client," she'd say. "Nothing interesting." I remember one Wednesday afternoon stopping by home unexpectedly to grab some blueprints I'd forgotten. Jason's silver BMW was parked across the street. I thought nothing of it. He worked from home after all. Maybe he was out for a walk or visiting someone else in the neighborhood. But something made me pause as I pulled into our driveway, some instinct I couldn't name yet. I shook it off and went inside, calling out for Vanessa. She appeared from upstairs looking flushed. "You startled me," she said, her hand at her throat. "I was just doing yoga." Her hair was slightly mussed, and she was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before. Something silky and red that seemed too formal for a day at home. "New dress?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "This old thing?" she said with a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "I've had it forever. Just felt like dressing up a bit for myself today." I nodded, grabbed my blueprints, and left with a quick kiss on her cheek. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw Jason walking down our street from the direction of our house, hands in his pockets, sunglasses hiding his eyes. That night, I lay awake beside Vanessa, listening to her breathing and wondering why my stomach felt so tight with unnamed dread. At our next neighborhood barbecue, I watched Vanessa and Jason interact. Their conversation seemed normal on the surface. Discussions about a new restaurant downtown, jokes about Portland's infamous rain. But there was something in the way they carefully didn't look at each other too long, the deliberate distance they maintained, that made my architect's mind think of negative space, the importance of what isn't there rather than what is. When I mentioned casually to Vanessa that Jason seemed to be spending a lot of time on our street lately, her reaction was immediate and defensive. "What are you implying, Daniel?" she snapped, color rising in her cheeks. "He's our friend, our neighbor. Don't be paranoid." Her response felt disproportionate, and for the first time, genuine suspicion took root in my mind. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I waited until Vanessa was asleep, her back to me in our bed, and carefully checked her phone. The guilt I felt was overwhelming. This wasn't who we were. This wasn't who I was. But the fear driving me was stronger than the guilt. I found nothing definitive. No explicit messages, no revealing photos, just an unusual number of deleted text conversations. The lack of evidence should have reassured me, but instead, it fed my growing anxiety. Professional people who have something to hide know how to hide it well. I sat for hours that night in my home office, staring at the rain trickling down the windows, torn between my suspicions and my love for Vanessa. Was I losing my mind? Or was I losing my marriage? I didn't know which possibility terrified me more. In the following weeks, I tried to dismiss my concerns. I threw myself into work, spending even longer hours at the office, telling myself I was being irrational. But the distance between Vanessa and me grew. Our conversations became perfunctory, discussions about grocery lists and utility bills rather than dreams and desires. When we made love, which was increasingly rare, she seemed present physically but mentally elsewhere, her eyes often closed, shutting me out of whatever fantasy played behind her eyelids. Our 10-year anniversary was approaching. I decided to use it as an opportunity to reconnect, to rebuild whatever was crumbling between us. I planned a surprise trip to Cannon Beach where we'd honeymooned, booking the same oceanfront suite. I was scheduled to be at a conference in Seattle that week, but I arranged to leave early without telling Vanessa. I wanted to surprise her, to remind her of who we were before life and work and whatever else had come between us. I remember every detail of that day with excruciating clarity. It was pouring rain as I drove home, the kind of relentless downpour that Portland is famous for. I'd stopped to buy Vanessa's favorite flowers, white peonies, absurdly expensive out of season, but I didn't care. I rehearsed my apology as I drove, for working too much, for not noticing sooner that something was wrong, for whatever part one had played in the growing silence between us. I turned onto our street at around 2 in the afternoon and immediately saw Jason's silver BMW in our driveway. My stomach dropped, but I still grasped at innocent explanations. Maybe he was borrowing something. Maybe Vanessa needed help with a household repair while I was away. Maybe. I parked across the street and sat there for a moment, rain drumming on the roof of my car, clutching the damp bouquet of peonies. Through the sheets of rain, I could see our living room window. The curtains were partially open, and there they were, Vanessa and Jason, locked in an embrace that couldn't possibly be explained away as friendly or innocent. Her arms were around his neck, his hands on her waist, their bodies pressed together in a way that told the entire story. I don't remember getting out of the car. I don't remember walking through the rain or opening the front door. My next clear memory is standing in our living room, soaking wet, watching them spring apart like guilty teenagers. The peonies were still clutched in my fist, water dripping onto our hardwood floors. "Daniel?" Vanessa gasped, her face draining of color. "You're supposed to be in Seattle." "Clearly," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Jason had the decency to look ashamed, but not enough to leave immediately. He stood there awkwardly, running a hand through his hair. "Dan, Man, I don't know what to say, he started. Get out of my house, I interrupted, my voice deadly quiet. Get out right now before I do something we'll both regret. He left without another word, the front door closing softly behind him. The gentle click somehow worse than a slam would have been. Vanessa and I stood facing each other in the home I had designed for our future, with rain lashing at the windows like nature itself was raging on my behalf. How long? I asked, the peony still ridiculously clutched in my hand. Daniel, please, let me explain, she began, tears starting to fall. How long? I roared, finally dropping the flowers, watching them scatter across the floor like casualties. 3 months, she whispered. It started 3 months ago. The pain was physical, a stabbing sensation in my chest as if she'd driven a blade between my ribs. 3 months. While I'd been working late to finish the community center design, while I'd been saving for our anniversary trip, while I'd been planning our future, she'd been planning afternoon rendezvous with our neighbor. I didn't mean for it to happen, she continued, her voice breaking. I was lonely, Daniel. You're never here, even when you're physically present. You're always thinking about work, about buildings, about everything but me. Her words felt like additional wounds. Was she actually trying to blame me for her betrayal? So this is my fault? I asked incredulously. I work hard to give us the life we always wanted, and that justifies sleeping with our neighbor? No, that's not what I'm saying, she protested, reaching for me. I stepped back as if her touch would burn me. Don't, I warned. Don't touch me. We argued for hours. Painful words hurled like weapons. Years of unspoken resentments suddenly exposed. She claimed I'd emotionally abandoned her long before she physically betrayed me. I accused her of taking the coward's way out instead of telling me she was unhappy. By nightfall, I had packed a bag and called my sister Claire. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, after I explained with as few words as possible what had happened. No questions, no judgment, just immediate support. That's who Claire has always been. I stayed with Claire for 2 weeks, sleeping on her pull-out couch, staring at her ceiling each night as I replayed every moment of my marriage, looking for the warning signs I'd missed. Claire gave me space when I needed it and sat with me in silence when words failed. You'll survive this, she told me one night as we shared a bottle of whiskey in her kitchen. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you will. I wasn't so sure. The pain was constant, a physical presence that followed me everywhere. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work. My business partner, Michael, had to take over the community center project when I missed deadlines for the first time in my career. Take some time, he urged after I snapped at a client during a meeting. Sort yourself out, man. The rage was the worst part. I've never been an angry person, but in those first few weeks after discovery, fury consumed me. I fantasized about revenge. Slashing Jason's tires, exposing their affair to the entire neighborhood, destroying the career he was so proud of. One night, after too much bourbon, I actually drove to his house with a can of spray paint in my back pocket, planning to leave my mark on his perfect home. I sat in my car for an hour, watching his windows, the can of paint heavy in my hand. In the end, I drove away without doing anything. Not because I had risen above my rage, but because degrading myself wouldn't heal what was broken inside me. Have you ever experienced betrayal that left you questioning everything? Comment below with how you found the strength to move forward. Vanessa continued to call and text, her messages swinging between apology and accusation. I see now that she was struggling too, trying to justify her actions to herself as much as to me. But at the time, each message felt like salt in my wounds. I blocked her number after a particularly painful exchange where she suggested that maybe we needed to, quote, take a break anyway. As if she hadn't already made that decision unilaterally when she invited another man into our bed. Eventually, I found an apartment downtown. A sterile, modern space, nothing like the warm home I'd designed. I hired movers to collect my clothes and personal items from our house, unable to face being there, while Vanessa watched me pack up pieces of my life. The day the movers delivered my things, I sat on the floor of my empty living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing the fragments of my former life. I found our wedding photo mixed in with my books, still in the silver frame Vanessa's mother had given us. I held it in my hands, looking at our younger, hopeful faces, and felt tears streaming down my cheeks for the first time since that rainy day of discovery. This was real. This was happening. The life I had so carefully designed was gone forever. Claire insisted I see a therapist after she found me one Sunday morning still awake at 4 a.m., researching Jason's marketing clients online, with some half-formed plan of professional sabotage brewing in my mind. "This isn't you, Daniel," she said, gently closing my laptop. "You need to talk to someone before you do something you can't take back." Dr. Phillips became my lifeline. A no-nonsense woman in her 50s with kind eyes and brutal honesty. "You're letting them take more from you than they already have," she told me in one of our first sessions. "Every minute you spend plotting revenge is another minute of your life they're stealing." I didn't want to hear it then, but her words stayed with me. The darkest moment came about 6 weeks after I'd moved out. I ran into Vanessa at our favorite coffee shop near the neighborhood. I hadn't been back to the area since leaving, but that morning I'd craved the specific comfort of their maple latte. She was sitting by the window, and for a split second before she saw me, I watched her, familiar yet somehow a stranger now. When our eyes met, the world seemed to stop. She approached me cautiously, looking both remorseful and defensive. "You look terrible," were her first words to me, and something in me snapped. "What did you expect?" I hissed, too loudly for the quiet cafe. "That I'd be thriving after finding my wife screwing our neighbor?" People turned to stare, and Vanessa's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Lower your voice," she demanded. "This is exactly why I felt so alone in our marriage. You never learned to communicate like an adult." The unfairness of her accusation left me speechless. I walked out without my coffee, shaking with rage and humiliation, feeling the pitying glances of strangers on my back. That night, I drank myself into oblivion and ended up scrolling through social media until I found recent photos of Vanessa and Jason together at a restaurant downtown. They weren't hiding anymore. The date on the post was just 3 weeks after I'd moved out. Looking at their smiling faces, their casual intimacy already established and public, I felt physically ill. How long had they really been together? Had anything Vanessa ever told me been the truth? I hit rock bottom that night, drunk dialing Claire at 2 a.m., barely coherent through my tears. "I don't know who I am anymore," I told her. "Everything I thought was real wasn't. Everything I built was a lie." "No," Claire said firmly. "Your marriage ended, Daniel. That's all. It doesn't invalidate who you are or what you've accomplished. It doesn't make you less worthy of love. It's just one part of your story, not the whole book." It took time for her words to sink in, but gradually they did. 6 months after that rainy day of discovery, I began to feel the fog lifting. Dr. Phillips had helped me see that, while Vanessa's betrayal was inexcusable, our marriage had problems long before Jason moved in next door. My workaholism hadn't caused her affair, that was her choice entirely, but it had created distance between us that neither of us had properly addressed. "You can acknowledge your part in the marriage's problems without taking responsibility for her betrayal," Dr. Phillips explained. "Those are separate issues." This perspective helped me begin to release some of the anger that had been poisoning me from within. I started running again, something I'd loved in college but had abandoned as work took over my life. The rhythm of my feet on Portland's waterfront paths became meditative. clearing my mind in ways that alcohol never could. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with, accepted weekend invitations I would have previously declined in favor of working, and even joined a recreational soccer league. The team was terrible, but the camaraderie was healing. Then came the day I ran into Jason at the hardware store. I'd been avoiding our old neighborhood entirely, but this particular store had specialty items I needed for a small renovation project in my apartment. I turned the corner into the paint aisle, and there he was, examining color swatches. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but something kept me rooted to the spot. When he looked up and saw me, his face registered shock, guilt, and something else. Fear, perhaps. He looked smaller somehow, less confident than the man who had charmed his way into my home and my marriage. "Daniel," he acknowledged, his voice quiet. I expected the rage to return, to feel that familiar burning in my chest at the sight of him. Instead, I felt a strange sense of pity. This man had built his happiness on someone else's pain. Whatever he and Vanessa had now was founded on deceit. What kind of foundation was that for any relationship? "Jason," I replied with a nod, then turned my attention to the shelf of paint rollers. He hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to flee or attempt conversation. "I know it doesn't change anything," he finally said, "but I am sorry for how things happened." The carefully worded non-apology, sorry for how things happened, not that they happened at all, might have enraged me months earlier. Now, it just confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't worth any more of my energy. "You're right," I said, selecting a roller and meeting his eyes directly. "It doesn't change anything." I walked away, feeling lighter somehow. That brief encounter marked a turning point in my recovery. I realized I didn't need grand confrontations or acts of revenge. I didn't need Vanessa to suffer or Jason to lose everything. I just needed to rebuild my own life, on my terms. I started dating again, cautiously. Nothing serious, just coffee or dinner with women Claire introduced me to, or people I met through my expanding social circle. The first few attempts were awkward. I hadn't dated in over a decade and had forgotten all the unwritten rules. But gradually, it became easier. I enjoyed female company again, without immediately comparing every woman to Vanessa. Last month I met someone who makes me laugh, who asks insightful questions about my architectural projects, who has her own full life and isn't looking to rush into anything. It's too early to know where it might lead, but for the first time I'm open to possibilities. The community center I designed opened last week. Standing at the ceremony, watching families explore the spaces I'd created, I felt a sense of professional pride that had been missing for months. Michael clapped me on the shoulder after the ribbon cutting. "You did it. Despite everything," he said, "this place is going to change lives." That same afternoon, I started sketching plans for a new house. Not another family home, but a place just for me. Something smaller, but filled with light, with a studio where I can work when inspiration strikes, and a deck overlooking the river where friends can gather. It won't be in our old neighborhood, won't be haunted by memories of what I've lost. Instead, it will be a physical manifestation of what I'm becoming. Someone new, someone stronger, someone who understands that some things fall apart so better things can be built in their place. I don't hate Vanessa anymore. That realization came gradually, like dawn breaking after a long night. The love we had was real, even if it didn't last. The life we built together shaped me in ways both painful and precious. I've heard through mutual friends that she and Jason are still together, though they've moved to Seattle for his work. I wish them neither happiness nor misery. I simply acknowledge that their story continues separately from mine. Dr. Phillips says this emotional neutrality is a sign of true healing. There are still hard days. Anniversaries, holidays, random Tuesday afternoons when a memory ambushes me and leaves me breathless with residual grief. But these moments come less frequently now. I've learned that healing isn't linear. It's a winding path with unexpected setbacks and surprising moments of clarity. What I know now that I didn't know before is that betrayal doesn't define you unless you let it. The story of my marriage and its painful end is just one chapter in my life, not the entire book. I'm working on the next chapters now, filling them with new characters, new adventures, and the wisdom that only comes from having your heart thoroughly broken and choosing to piece it back together anyway. This story of betrayal and healing is one many of us face. Subscribe to Levitt Daily for more real stories of how people find strength after devastating personal loss. The blueprints for my new house sit on my desk now, nearly complete. Like me, they're a work in progress, subject to revisions and improvements as new insights emerge. But the foundation is solid, and this time I'm building something that doesn't depend on anyone else's promises to remain standing.